Linux Luddites, episode 59, for the 25th of October, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. And coming up on today's show, we'll be bringing you all the latest news from in and around the free and open source world, plus wondering whether a blog post blaming everyone except the KDE team for the state of the Plasma desktop actually contains some wider uncomfortable truths for the entire Linux ecosystem. But before all that, I'd like to say a huge personal thank you to Pete and Andrew for stepping into the breach whilst I was away. Made a real change sitting in front of a speaker rather than behind a mic, but it seemed to go well.
I don't know, they were good, but they were no you, Paddy.
Yeah, there was a distinct lack of mumbling going on.
No, it was really great of them to step in and help us out, but hopefully we'll be resuming normal service despite me being full of man flu.
Yeah, a big welcome back, Paddy. You're sorely missed.
Yeah, I did notice some of the unfortunate side effects of my absence.
Side effects?
Yeah, TDTRS has come back.
He clearly got the bug.
No, I think that was a case of Matt was wanting to get one in before our camp and managed to finally get round to it. But we'll see if they manage to do any more going forward. Somehow, I don't know, I can't see it. I think Matt's just too busy these days.
It's a welcome return, so nice to hear you again, Pete. Anyway, with that, should we get on with the news?
Yeah, let's do it. So first up then, the news that OpenBSD is 20 years old. And they've marked it with more of their really great spoof songs.
They do this every release, don't they?
Yeah. Someone must like them, even if I don't. But yeah, this time they've done a few Beatles songs and one original one. But 20 years is a fair while. I didn't realise it had been around that long.
Yeah, the first source code came out a couple of months after Windows 95.
Yeah, so in those 20 years, there's been some key bits of software, most notably OpenSSH, which I use all the time. I know that you guys do, and probably most of our listeners. Anything else that they've produced that's particularly of note?
Well, more recently, of course, there's LibreSSL. PF is a well-known packet filter, particularly in the BSD world. I guess really it's the attitude, though, that has, I think, helped us all enormously. I mean, they've got a huge focus on correctness and documentation, and sadly, some of that doesn't always translate into the Linux world, but for that, I'm very thankful.
Yeah, well, not quite as long as OpenBSD, but at 19 years, this is KDE's milestone.
19 glorious years, eh?
Exactly. So it was on the 14th of October 1996, Matthias Ettrich started developing it and had the first release in July of 1998. And we'll put in the show notes, someone has done a literally point-by-point release and all of the details as to which is in every single one, all the way up to Plasma 5. So if you want to know everything that's happened in the history of KDE for those 19 years, then by all means go and have a look. It's a real blow-by-blow detail.
And it was the screenshots that got my attention, really. I mean, what did you think to how the look and feel has changed over the years?
Well, it's just aped Windows, hasn't it? Pretty much. And as Windows has changed, so has KDE.
Yeah, it's got more glossy. I was surprised to see actually the consistency between the taskbar at the bottom, the sort of four windows showing you your desktops, and the start button, if you will, the menu button in the bottom left. And that seems to have stayed almost true throughout everything. But like Joe says, they've just got sort of fancier, or the colours have changed. It's got more transparent or not, as Windows seems to have gone through its sort of Vista and 8 and 10 years.
But yeah, you do have to respect the fact that they have chosen a paradigm and stuck to it. As you say, taskbar at the bottom, start menu. And even from those very early kind of almost Amiga-ish looking releases all the way through to Plasma 5, the fundamental way it works hasn't changed. And that is a good thing. I mean, that's kind of the whole ethos of this show, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I've got to assume that since it's been going for 19 years, it's incredibly stable now. Mature, solid, tested.
Well, I think 4 is, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll be coming back to this later in the show, but just sort of sticking down a marker at this point.
Yeah. And GNOME's not that much younger, is it? It turned 18 back in August.
Yeah, and of course, GNOME was started as a reaction, really, to KDE and the technology that was built on.
Yeah, the people who weren't really happy with Qt clearly had a bit of a get-together and pulled out a GTK-based DE. And while we're on birthdays, we can say happy birthday to Ubuntu, who was 11 years old, or which was 11 years old this year.
Yeah, and we've come full circle on the W's. We've gone from Warty Warthog back in the early days to, is it Wily Werewolf, came out last week?
Yeah, and then there's whatever the next one is.
Yeah, the squirrel. Squirrel!
Is it Xenial? Xenial squirrel? I don't know. I think they're just scraping the barrel a bit there. It's about time they just started calling them their numbers, I think. But there you go. And CentOS is 12 years old as well.
Yes, that sort of gives you an idea as to how long some of these major distributions and desktop environments and things have been around. 20, 19, 10, 11 years. So by now you'd think they'd really know what they were doing, have a plan, be set at it, and be fairly stable. But we'll come back to discuss that in an Over a Pint later. But what have Mozilla been up to this week?
Well, Mozilla have launched something called the Open Source Support Program, and it's a new pay back and pay forward funding program. And initially it's going to have a pot of $1 million, with more promised in the future. Now, they've had a grant program for several years, but and to quote their blog post, now it is time to formalise a systematic way to provide a new level of support to the community. I've got to be honest though, at this stage it does look a little bit driven by self-interest, because they also say Mozilla relies on a number of open source and free software projects. In some cases, the software produced by these projects is incorporated into Mozilla projects. In other cases, we rely on them as part of our infrastructure or to get our jobs done. Projects which fit into this category and who are in need of funds are welcome to apply for an award.
So they're basically saying, we'll give you money if you make us better.
Yeah, but there's nothing particularly wrong with enlightened self-interest, is there?
Not really. It's all free software and it's not much different from hiring a developer, is it really? It's more a case of do the thing first, then we'll give you money rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I've got to wonder whether this is an attempt to branch out in this direction. We see a lot of this behaviour from the Linux Foundation, for instance, and it's a way of growing, and since their products don't seem to be helping them do so.
Yeah, I just wonder where they pulled this £1 million or dollars out of. Like you say, they've been shrinking in market share for their flagship, Firefox, the browser. So I just sort of wonder if they actually are, making enough money to allow them to pump it back into the ecosystem. It's a good thing to do, but you need to get your finances straight in the first place. So let's hope that this is something that they can keep up year after year rather than being, something they shout about this year and then actually realise they can't afford it in the future.
Well, just wait till Google pulls the plug, eh? But until then, they've got all those millions of dollars coming in.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, to be honest. I'm usually the cynical one here, but it's a nice initiative and I wish them well with this at the moment.
Fair enough. Well, speaking of Google, they've killed the Chrome Notification Center because pretty much no one uses it. Now, I don't use Chrome generally, so I've never even seen this notification center. You two both do. Have you ever used it?
Yeah, the first thing you do when you install Chrome is you disable it. And the second thing you do when you install Chrome is disable the downloading for offline docs. And then you can actually start using Chrome. I don't think anybody uses this.
No, absolutely, I agree. It looks a lot like the sort of Google Now cards, which tells you information of emails or Google Plus posts and things like this, but I just don't ever use it. I have a little icon for a shortcut for Gmail, and that shows me if I've got a new email, although it shows the thousands of unread ones I've got, so it doesn't really make much sense. And if you're using any of the Google products in the browser, then it shows you, if you've got Google Plus posts and things. So I just use those. I don't even know how to find this thing, so no, I can see why they killed it off given that no one uses it and we don't even know how it works.
Is this going to affect Chromium then, or was it never in there in the first place?
I honestly don't know. I can't recall seeing it last time I installed Chromium, but I've been such a bad man and been using straight Chrome now for a long time, so I don't know. Jesse?
Yeah, I can't answer that either. I have only ever used Chrome. I used Chromium once ages ago and didn't find it as integrated and feature rich, let's say.
Fair enough.
And carrying on with things that Google has removed this week, they've taken out the OK Google voice search function from the Chrome browser. It also was removed from the Chromium browser back in June due to some binary blob controversy. But this is the feature that when you're on google.co.uk or google.com, it is constantly monitoring your microphone to hear if you say OK Google, and then it does a voice search from that. And basically, similar to the last story, no one used it. And so rather than having this constantly monitoring and the sort of the pushback they get from people who are worried about the voice monitoring all the time, they've removed it. And you can still press the microphone button, you can click on it and do a voice search. It's just the OK Google function has been removed.
This is on the desktops, isn't it? I think it's still in the slave tracking devices.
Yeah, it's still in phones and Chromebooks, so it's only really the desktop. But it's funny that you say that, Jesse, that it was listening when you were on google.co.uk or .com, because it definitely wasn't listening when you were on other sites. I reckon that it pretty much boils down to finances. It was costing them money to record all this stuff, and if people weren't using it and they weren't getting any useful data that they can base some adverts on, then what's the point of continuing to pay for it?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got quite used to doing OK Google things on my phone, mostly when my hands are tied up cooking or something like that, but I've never used it on the desktop. In fact, only testing it for this news article did I use it on my Chromebook. I went, oh yeah, still works on the Chromebooks, okay, and that's about it.
I don't know why anyone would want to start saying OK Google at any sort of device. If you've got a decent keyboard, you can just type it in. If you've got a hardware keyboard on the £1 million BlackBerry that's just come out, then you definitely wouldn't need it.
Well, actually, the time I use it is for interfacing with apps and stuff. So I could get my phone, open the music player, Google Music, and find the person I want to play or find the song. But actually, I can say, OK, Google, play do-do-do melody by so-and-so, and it will just do it. I can put my phone back down and walk away, and it does it on its own and starts playing it. So it's sort of, it is quicker by just going, do this, this is this. And then while it's churning through those commands, I'm not saying it's taking up my life by opening the music player, obviously, but it is sometimes useful.
It all seems a bit too futuristic for me.
I'm curious, we weren't going to talk about this in the slightest, and it isn't in the show notes, but this BlackBerry thing, have you had a look at it?
Oh, yes.
I thought you might have somehow. It's got a slidey keyboard, hasn't it?
Yeah, I really, really want one, but it's more expensive than an iPhone, which is just ridiculous. They're just not going to sell any of them. I can't believe it. We finally get a QWERTY slider, and it's a portrait slider rather than landscape, which makes more sense, actually. Now I've seen it in action, because phones have got too big to be landscape sliders. But I really, really want one. But it's like nearly 600 quid, man. Like, I don't know what they're playing at. Well, I think what they want to do is sell it to enterprise, where no one is actually footing the bill. It's a department is footing the bill rather than a person. But what I'm really hoping is that they will make millions of them ready to sell, won't sell any, and then will be forced to drop the price like they did with their Playbook, where they ended up selling them off dirt cheap. And hopefully I'll be able to pick one up then. But until then, no way am I paying that sort of money for one.
Yeah, because the 64 meg Playbook's down to like 50 quid now, I was seeing on Morgan the other day.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they're hoping this is going to save them. But, if they'd priced it at something reasonable, like $350, they would have just flown off the shelves, and they would have probably ultimately made more money. But they're being greedy, pricing it at like $580. And no, it's just ridiculous.
Is this the one that runs Android?
Yeah.
Ah, so are they going solely for a hardware bent rather than doing their own software as well now?
Well, this is their first foray into it, into putting Android onto a BlackBerry hardware. And BlackBerry hardware has always been quite solid, and so the people have been calling for them to do this for a long time. And sure enough, now they've done it. And I don't know, thinking back about, 10 months to our prediction show, what did I predict that would happen this year? Oh, that's right. There would be a slide-out QWERTY keyboard running Android with decent specs. So that's going to be another win for me. So you better be quaking in your boots, chaps.
You're going to be unbearable in December.
It always is. Go on, moving it on rapidly then. Staying with Google, though, they're looking to ease potential customers away from Microsoft and IBM software licensing agreements by letting them run Google Apps for Work for free until the expiry of the enterprise agreement that they're actually locked into. And they're also going to be subsidizing the deployment of that via a program that connects the customer with a Google for Work partner organization.
So this is for an enterprise who is currently using some sort of Microsoft Office suite.
Yep.
And they're paying Microsoft by the month, let's say, and rather than carrying on doing that, they can switch over to use Google for free. Why would you switch over to use Google for free when you still have an availability of the Microsoft Office suite? I don't see. I understand that they've taken away the hurdle of the price, but you're still paying Microsoft, so why don't you just carry on using that until the end and then switch over to Google?
And then when you've got an organization of 5,000-10,000 people who suddenly need training and start using a competitive product the next day.
So you think this is to use both of them at the same time and ease the transition?
Absolutely. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, I also wonder, my other problem is that I use, the full Office suite at work, 2013 or whatever it is, and it's got all sorts of functions and functionality that docs and sheets and things like this don't have. So I don't see how you can compare it one to one. It's apples and oranges. It's just not there, I don't think.
Yeah, well, this was something I was actually going to bring up, because if you read the post on the Google website, it says, "We've made it easy by covering most of the features some are claimed to be missing and adding nifty new stuff like voice typing and Explore." Now, there's a link there for the claim to be missing section, and it's basically talking about collaborative features, so things like marking up changes. But as you suggest, Jesse, there's far more in, say, Microsoft Office currently than appears to be in Docs at the moment.
Yeah, the one that always gets me is I try and do graphs and stuff in Sheets, and I always feel like I'm banging my head against the wall. And as soon as I do it in Office at work, it's a click of my fingers and it's there. Now, I know I'm used to the way that Office works, but I still should not find it that difficult to make a graph. And all of the way that you do things with headers and footers and paragraph breakups and having landscape pages and stuff for massive reports and things, I just don't see them available in Docs. I don't think you can compare the two.
Perhaps we're in 80-20 territory, and they're really pitching this at, say, secretarial work where you're just writing letters or something, and you can do that perfectly well in Docs, and it's just the complicated stuff that perhaps, unfortunately, most of us are actually involved in, that it doesn't cover off very well.
Yeah, I've always seen Google Docs as more aimed at people like me who don't do complicated actual office work. I just, as you say, write letters and write notes, and if I do a spreadsheet, it's going to be very basic. I don't need to do complicated things with it. I don't think that industries like what you do, Jesse, engineering and stuff, I just can't see them making the switch over. I think that Microsoft products are so embedded there. I mean, you know better than anyone what it's like. Everything is Microsoft, isn't it? I mean, could you see them possibly changing to Google? I mean, it just seems like a pipe dream to me.
Yeah, not in a month for Sundays. That's never going to happen. I mean, the full Office suite is there, Visio and all these other things. And the idea that you would use I'm going to say inferior graphing software that is available in Sheets and things, it's just not going to happen. And it was a big enough switch getting the people who are maybe, let's say, slightly more senior in my organization to move from whatever Office it was that didn't have the ribbon to the one that now does. It was like a grinding gear change for most people, and that was just using one Microsoft Office version to another where they changed the look of it a little bit, let alone going to a fully online and completely different bit of software. I mean, it would be better for me because there's far more ability to use it at home online, which I think is important, and which Microsoft, unless you use 365, which we don't, there's no way of actually doing that. You have to be at work or you have to have a remote logon. So Office isn't perfect, and like Google have said in their press release, it's useful that you can do collaborative things online from anywhere. But Microsoft will catch up, and they will, I think, integrate 365 into main Office.
I think it's quite telling that we've not mentioned LibreOffice once in this discussion.
I think something that applies to them as well as to Google Docs is important here, and that is the integration issue. I mean, you think about word processing, and a lot of people just type letters, but there is an awful lot of integration out there with other software packages for ERP and stuff like that people use out in industry. And a lot of us just desktop Linux users don't consider that.
Well, moving it on then, cloud software companies seem to be doing quite well, or at least on the surface of things. According to a survey by Pacific Crest Securities, both large and small software companies are expected to finish the year with growth of about 46%. But the kind of fly in the ointment there is they're spending a whole lot of money to make not quite as much. And I mean, if you just look at DigitalOcean, for example, I mean, they are spending an awful lot advertising, an awful lot on affiliate stuff like they do with us. And, you know, I mean, potentially if you sign up to them with an affiliate link, they don't get any money for like 7 months or something. And so there's a lot of venture capital going into this, a lot of subsidy and debt. And, you know, they might be growing, but that isn't necessarily a reflection of the profit that they're making, because most of them aren't making any profit at all.
Yeah, this report is saying that for every dollar they get back from their customers, they've actually spent $1.18 to get that customer in the first place. And obviously, those economics do not add up. But I guess the idea is that you get a market share, you get a monopoly, and then once you've got those customers, it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to walk away and go to a competitor. So it's all about getting people in the door and then squeezing them for money. So it's clearly giving a long-term sort of plan, which they're hoping will pay off in the future.
Yeah, and I'm deeply suspicious of a lot of these online ventures, because there seems to be no way they're actually going to make money in the future. That you can have all the clients in the world, but if there's no way to monetize the product, then it doesn't matter how much growth you have, you're never going to get anywhere. But it's always been the case. Picks and shovels, I think, is the expression. There's tool vendors and the people who provide the platforms as opposed to what runs on top of them are doing quite nicely, thank you. And Amazon's third quarter earnings came out recently. I was quite interested to read this. I mean, they brought in $2.1 billion from AWS in revenue during the quarter, which was only 8% of their total revenue. But that translated to over $500 billion in profits, which was almost exactly the same as Amazon's profits from retail sales in the whole of North America. And it was roughly half of all of Amazon's profits worldwide.
I was more interested in the fact that they are actually making a profit now, because they made a loss for a long time, didn't they?
They did, yes. They were pursuing exactly the strategy that you were talking about a minute ago, of just constant growth and not worrying about making money. And really, it is Amazon Web Services that's kind of dragging them towards profitability.
But is that sustainable? I mean, it seems that the retail side of things is definitely sustainable, because they've basically put everyone else out of business now, all the small actual retailers, you know, bricks and mortar, as they say. But, you know, if this technology bubble really is a bubble, then presumably when it pops or deflates or whatever you want to call it, Amazon Web Services is going to take a hit, isn't it? And they've already spent the money on the infrastructure, and if no one's using it, then they're not going to be bringing in any revenue for it.
No, I can't see that happening. I think more and more is going to go online, and for that to be online and cloud, you're going to have that infrastructure, whether that be the companies and the services that we see today, or whether it be the next round of them, which do have more sort of financial planning and a way of monetizing whatever it is they're producing or selling. They're still going to have a big number crunching and server backend. And at the moment, AWS have placed themselves in the prime position, and it's the place that everywhere goes. And I think on another news story from a couple of weeks ago, we had about the percentage of Ubuntu instances running on AWS meant that Ubuntu was one of the biggest server installs out there. So I think either way, whatever happens with the services we think of now, and in my head I keep on thinking of Twitter and how they have no way of monetizing it, despite the fact it's absolutely huge. If those do die away in a sort of .com bubble, something's going to take their place, and Amazon will remain that backbone. I think they're going to sell their services no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think of things like Twitter and public-facing companies, but I mean, a lot of the use of AWS is actually for corporates. So it isn't really stuff that we see on a day-to-day basis, and that demand is going to continue because the whole industry is still pushing towards cloudifying everything.
So as cloud services expand and more of the functions of a PC move online, it's not surprising that actual PC sales have declined. And this has resulted in the slightly odd PC does what campaign, which that's my best way of saying that. It's sort of by a group of companies coming together who are, the hardware manufacturers, and trying to promote what modern PCs, i.e. what modern laptops can do. So there's all of those Lenovo's that flip around, there's ones you can detach the screen, there's Ultrabooks which are super thin, they've improved their sound, things like this. And so there's a slightly sort of weird, cringy set of adverts. The one I watched was a rescue helicopter flying out, and the lady jumps on board with this Lenovo flip back one, which is touchscreen, and she flips it round, and the guy on the ground's going, PC does what? And it just has a number of different situations where a modern PC has something which I guess the average person doesn't know about. It's all a bit kind of weird.
It's got an air of desperation and a death rattle about it, hasn't it?
It does. On the YouTube comments, someone said, PC does everything but make good commercials. I think that kind of sums it up nicely.
I think they're pitching these horribly, horribly badly. I mean, much as the Linux Foundation's efforts are as well, to be honest. A lot of the features they're demonstrating aren't available in all PCs, for one thing, and that's a key factor. I mean, if you're trying to advertise and proselytize the benefits of a particular class of hardware, it's got to be available on all that hardware, or at least the majority of the hardware. And if people just pop down to the local PC retailer, they're not going to see PCs that do all these things in these adverts. So it ain't good on that score. And they're pitching the wrong differentiators. I mean, you need a PC in your home potentially to act as a home hub for file storage, as an entertainment center, what have you. And instead they're talking about, the screen can just turn backwards, when if you're using a box for that purpose, it's going to be stuffed underneath your television and you're not going to be looking at the screen anyway. And they're talking about things like GPS, which is available on tablets anyway, and that's the market they're fighting against. So I think their idea of differentiation is so off base, it's unbelievable.
So most of these features they're talking about, you're absolutely right, are in the most expensive, top-of-the-range Ultrabooks and hardware and things. And one of them, there's a short cut to it as he sort of changes something on the laptop. And I thought it was an Apple Mac, because the Ultrabooks, are sort of chasing that Apple Mac type feel. They're more expensive, they're made of metal, all these sorts of things. And so I don't know whether they're trying to say, don't use Apples and iDevices, you should be using PCs as well. Or, if they're trying to differentiate from Apple, or if they're just trying to differentiate from tablets and other form factors. But like you say, it all just seems to be a bit of a weird blur of these things. And I can't think of many people who are going to go, oh yeah, let's just walk down to the shop and drop $1,000 on a new laptop, when, as far as I can see, one that costs £300 does exactly the same stuff.
Yeah, and the reason for buying a new laptop in the past would probably have been to get a new version of Windows. And of course, we've just had Windows 10 come out, and that's freely downloadable anyway. So that takes away the incentive to buy the hardware.
Yeah, freely downloadable even if you don't want it.
Yeah. Windows 10 isn't actually driving these sales in the slightest. I mean, we've spoken in the past about the travails of AMD and Intel, and the chief exec of AMD came out and said, quote, "We're not anticipating Windows 10 will drive a dramatic near-term PC refresh cycle." I mean, he did try and put a positive spin on things for longer term, but I was looking back at it, and Windows has had the same minimum hardware requirements for quite a few releases now. I think it goes back to Windows 7, if memory serves. And certainly anecdotal evidence that I've seen and my personal experience sort of suggests that actually Windows 10 is more performant than 7 or 8 were. So why on earth would you be looking at a hardware upgrade?
Because your machine has slowed down horribly and it's broken and you need to buy a new machine. I think that's what they're hoping.
I genuinely remember those radio adverts a couple of years ago. They were saying, has your PC slowed down? Buy a new one. I was like, no, that's not the answer.
Yeah, I think that's the only hope for new PC sales, honestly, is people who don't realize that you can fix software, you can reinstall Windows, you could even install Linux. Wow, if you're really adventurous. But, to reinstall Windows is fairly straightforward, and I do that for a lot of people who otherwise think their machine's broken. But if they don't know someone who's techie enough to do that, then your only real option is to buy a new machine.
I worry about this AMD story and their profits looking more buoyant at the moment, because I know that in conversations with you, Joe, you've always said there's no point in buying AMD, always buy Intel when it comes to main processors. And while AMD's profits might be looking good, I can't help but feel that has a lot to do with the fact they are the sole manufacturer of both PS4 and Xbox One GPUs. And so if you have that in the bag, you're going to be making a shed load of money from everyone who buys these games consoles. And so I don't think it really is reflective of their position in the PC market as such.
Yeah, and they make a load from PC graphics cards as well, don't they?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, on the CPU side, they have a minuscule market share. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I was quite gobsmacked when I found out how low it really was in comparison to Intel. And Intel are having a really hard time of it at the moment as well. I mean, their profits in Q3 were down 6% on the same period last year, and both sales and gross margins also fell. And again, this comes back to the decline in the PC, really, and it's only the data center side of things that are keeping the ship afloat. And Intel is kind of doubling down on things because they've gone out and borrowed another $8 billion as part of the financing they require to buy Altera. And Altera designed chips that Intel already manufacture for them, primarily for the data center. This is FPGAs and such like. But I'm not sure that's going to really pan out either, because Altera itself's just had a torrid third quarter, and like-for-like earnings for them were down by almost half over last year. So there really isn't a huge amount of light at the end of the tunnel for Intel.
I think for x86 generally, is what we're talking about here, that things have moved over to ARM. And first of all, it was phones and tablets. And I mean, even Torvalds is predicting a decent ARM-based laptop coming soon. And we're seeing that move in the data center as well, aren't we? I mean, that is a slower move, but I think it's inevitable just because ARM is so much more efficient in terms of power usage. I mean, I know that right now they're fairly low computing power, but they use a fraction of the electricity to run. So, I mean, at the moment, your only real hope is to cluster them. But as they get more and more powerful, and we're starting to see 64-bit versions of them, I seriously think that you're going to see data centers that are all ARM because they use less power, less cooling, and they're just more efficient.
Yeah, and comparing their income to Intel's this third quarter, their pre-tax profit climbed 27%, and that's to about £130 million. However, if you look at Intel, their profits this quarter are like $3 billion. So there's still quite a way for ARM to go, I think.
Yeah, but what about the manufacturers of ARM? I mean, ARM are just licensing it out. So they're not getting their hands dirty, are they, with the manufacturing and all that kind of stuff? So it's you have to look at a broader set of companies with ARM, people like Samsung who are manufacturing it. And so I think that it's not really fair to compare ARM itself as a company with Intel.
No, particularly so when the Internet of Things kicks off properly, as it's been promised to. I mean, the number of devices out there will just be astronomical.
Yeah.
And one of those ARM devices which was available and now curiously isn't is the Meizu MX4, the Ubuntu edition, because Meizu Mart, which was the one European outlet for all Meizu phones, including the Ubuntu phone, has just sort of closed. The belief is that this is because they want to concentrate on China and that they don't want to put too many eggs in different baskets, and they've just pulled it off. And they've said in the statement that the page is closed. They will carry on to produce the existing contracts and things with people, and you can still access your account online, but you can't buy any more phones. And this means that there is currently no way you can buy the Ubuntu MX4. So that's a bit of a kick in the... for a canonical. Finish the sentence yourself.
Well, is it or isn't it? I don't know. I mean, at first I thought that, well, okay, so their high-end Ubuntu phone has gone away now. Now there's only the BQ ones, the Aquarius 4.5 and the 5 HD, which I looked last night and are still available. But then you hear what Popey let slip, deliberately or not, you decide, on the latest Ubuntu podcast, that there are new devices coming, and maybe they are going to replace the MX4 at the high end of things. Who knows? But I mean, as it stands right now, the flagship Ubuntu phone is no longer available, and that looks bad to me.
But you're never going to try and replace the flagship. You're just going to add more devices in that tier, aren't you? You always want as many devices as possible so that everyone has an option as to what price they want, or whether it's on a better camera or what have you. Or if they just had a high, medium and low phone and said that covers all our bases, it's a bit sort of narrow-minded. So it must come as a negative thing that it's been removed, because you always want to have more options, don't you?
Well, not if you're looking to cut your support costs down, having to push out new images, updates, that sort of thing. It's a much cheaper and easier business model if you've got fewer phones to support.
Are you putting a positive, polished spin on this negative Canonical story?
Yeah, I don't know what's wrong. I must be ill.
It must be the illness.
No, I mean, it's positive from their point of view, but I think from a consumer's point of view, you're right. The more choice is better. And having an even higher end phone than the MX4 would have been great, like with a 4K screen or whatever. But right now, your only options are a low end one and a kind of low end one. But that's not the only woes Canonical have had this week. They had a major issue on their phone platform that affected hundreds of thousands of users. Oh no, 15 people. Okay, so it wasn't that big a deal. And that was because someone uploaded a application to their app store or whatever they call it on Ubuntu that kind of roots your phone and changes the splash screen and just takes it over, basically, if you're dumb enough to click the Tap Me button on it. Why you'd install something that's called Test and then tap a button that says Tap Me. I suppose curiosity killed the cat. Curiosity bricked your phone, in this case, or rooted it. And to be fair to Canonical, they've been very transparent, or they've been transparent about this. They've said exactly what went on, exactly who was affected or how many people who were affected. And it's not a huge deal, except for how can stuff like this get past their automated testing system, which they admitted to that. So you have to give them credit for at least not trying to cover this up. But it does look very bad for them. And the fact that only 15 people were affected, 2 of whom work for Canonical, kind of doesn't really doesn't look good for the numbers, does it? We were talking about that a couple of weeks ago, how many people use Ubuntu phones, how many users are there out there? And not many is the answer.
I think you've summarised that nicely. And something that may well bring more users to the Ubuntu phone ecosystem is the idea of being able to run any Linux application on there. And this is obviously the dream of the convergent desktop, where you can plug your phone into a monitor and a keyboard, and then boom, you have a full version of Ubuntu running, able to run any application, not just those which are in the App Store and things. And Michael Hall, the Ubuntu community manager, recently posted a screenshot showing, I think it's GIMP and Firefox running on his Nexus 4. And so there's obviously moving towards convergence. They're obviously able to get these things running. So this is using Xmir running these X11 applications. They apparently are still very buggy, so there's a lot of things to do. But this is where Unity 8 is going. So it's interesting. It's good to see that progress is being made.
And they're still working on Nexus 4.
Yeah, that is a bit odd, I have to admit. I thought they'd have maybe upgraded to a 5 by now.
I told you the Nexus 4 is where it's at. It's a great phone. No wonder they keep using it. I hope they keep developing stuff for it. And why don't they put out Plasma, whatever it was called, Plasma phone for the Nexus 4 so I can try it out on my old one. But you're right, this is good news. It's good to see progress on this convergence, and I do wish them well. I don't think that it's necessarily going to work how I want it to, but if you could plug a phone into a screen and use it as a proper PC, it would be great. And if there was more flexibility on what you could have running on the phone and running on the PC side of things, then it would suit me better. But you need this pioneering work in the first place to make that happen. And the fact that it is totally free software is great.
Oh, maybe it's not totally free software, but I'm getting slightly ahead of myself there. Something else Ubuntu have done recently is reinstate the Developer Summit. And that used to be a biennial MeetSpace meetup, really, for Ubuntu devs. And the plug was pulled, I think it was a couple of years back, and it was transitioned to an online event. And now they're reviving that as a real-world event again. Now, clearly the idea here is to get developers more re-engaged with the Ubuntu ecosystem. So Are they short of developers? Are they looking to bolster that aspect of the brand while they're desperately trying to sell the company? I mean, what's going on?
I think they're gently backtracking on a bad decision. Clearly, it's nice to get together and have everyone speak face-to-face and things. And while you get all these nice ways of being able to interact online, it's not quite the same. And so they've sort of... I think they're going back to an annual one, aren't they? So this one is going to be at scale. And they're just trying to allow people to meet and get together. But this is only after the community council and some of the team members that participate in that said they should have more of a face-to-face. So I think they've just had to go back on what they decided previously.
Yeah, nothing quite beats a face-to-face meeting. I mean, that's part of why I want to go to OggCamp, because there are a lot of people who I speak to online, but it's just nice to actually meet in person, even if it is once a year. And I think you're right, Jesse, it was a mistake to go purely online. I think that maybe they could have, I don't know, scaled back the face-to-face summit and had the online one as well. And yeah, maybe it is just a reversal of that bad decision. Maybe it's just as simple as that, rather than the more ulterior motives that you accusing them of, Paddy.
I'm making no accusations at all. I'm just asking questions. So come on then. I hinted at not necessarily being totally free and open source software on the phone. I mean, that's an accusation that's been levelled at Canonical previously by Jonathan Riddle. And he's not around anymore, is he?
No, I mean, he stepped down as the project lead, or even though they didn't have one, I never got my head around that. But he was the release manager still of Kubuntu. And now with 15.10 released and out of the way, he has stepped down. And I'm sure that a lot of people saw this coming. It was not a surprise at all. He kind of had the responsibility to get this one out the door and finished. And now he's just had enough, just totally had enough of Canonical and the whole Ubuntu way of doing things. And it's quite sad, really. I mean, I know that we don't give KDE and Kubuntu any love at all on this show, but there are clearly a lot of people who like KDE, and it seems that you need a strong leader to make good things happen. And he clearly was that, even though he claimed not to be, whatever. But now he's gone. You kind of fear for where Kubuntu will go. I mean, might it just end up being really boring? I mean, we've got through all this news and not mentioned the 15.10 release at all yet. I mean, why is that? It's because it's been a really boring release, as usual. I mean, I looked at the full Unity version of Ubuntu and I just couldn't see any difference at all, really. Just everything that I hated about it is still the same. Everything I liked about it, or the few things I liked about it, is still the same. Looked at the flavors. Lubuntu's got quite a wacky wallpaper. Apart from that, not much difference. Xubuntu looks a little bit more modern. I mean, without strong leadership, you just stagnate, don't you? And potentially Kubuntu, I mean, people say that it's going to continue without him, but I don't know. Maybe it won't. Maybe if he starts something else that's better or more exciting, maybe the people who are developing Kubuntu at the moment will follow him to that. And you'll just end up with a very, well, either very boring Kubuntu or non-existent potentially.
So I seem to remember when you spoke to Jonathan back on show 43, Joe, that he was talking about potentially moving upstream and going to work for Debian.
Well, he seemed to have quite a lot of ideas rattling around in his head. I mean, it was a very turbulent time, and I don't think he decided then, and maybe he hasn't quite decided now. Maybe he's going to have a bit of time off. I don't know. But until he officially announces something, I think it's just pure speculation, really.
I think it would be a bad place to be, to have one of the two biggest desktop environments not being made for the biggest Ubuntu distribution. So I hope it does continue. But reversing the story somewhat back to this convergence and things, and it's news of a new device, and in fact an entirely new concept and paradigm in computing, blank sheet, all those sorts of blue sky thinking type things. This is the Solu, which is from Finland, and it's a 4-inch square sort of puck-type, wood-backed, edge-to-edge, touch-enabled screen, all these sort of jazzy things, with a 2.3 gigahertz processor inside. And it basically, while you might picture like a very square, quite thick phone, the idea is that you can compute on it if you wish, on this 4x4-inch screen, but also, as Canonical are thinking of doing, connect it up to HDMI to get a 4K display out of it, and a keyboard, and it becomes your full PC. And they've got a completely different interface. It's got a lot of information on the cloud, so it's got sort of a 32 gig cache within the hardware and 4 gig of RAM and things. But the idea is that you connect it up to Wi-Fi, you plug it into a monitor and a keyboard, and the puck itself becomes your touchpad, so you don't need a mouse. And then you use this device, and it's a strangely new and very different way of using computers, which they're pitching as a new paradigm and the way that cloud computing should be. So what's your take on it, guys?
What's my take on this? Well, given that I don't even like Unity because that is slightly different, I don't think I'm going to like a completely new way of doing computing. I mean, the box itself looks all right. It looks quite well designed, and I like the wood finishing on it, and a 4-inch little touchscreen device that you can use as a mouse. But where it really fell down for me were the 2 points. One, that everything's stored on the cloud. 3 points really. 2, that you have to pay, how much a month is it? Like 20 or 30 quid a month? No, thank you very much. Good business model, but I'm not buying into it. And then the other is that we don't have Windows or a taskbar or any of that. We've just got these weird bubbles that look like some sort of mind map. It's just ridiculous, I'm afraid. It's never going to get anywhere. And I like how the creator is in the video saying, oh, there's going to be people who don't like this, but the people who do like it, we're the future, man. It's like, well, good luck, mate.
Yeah, I must admit, if you go to their website as opposed to the Kickstarter page or the link in, is it The Guardian that I stuck in the show notes as a backgrounder? There's a long video on their main website, which is actually the launch event, and you can sit through half an hour of this, which was typical launch event with a few tech fails. But I was really intrigued, to be honest. It got me thinking about interface design, because I mean, clearly we all like and still use the windowed taskbar sort of paradigm, and I personally really can't abide things like GNOME have done or Unity, and this is completely different again, and it was kind of appealing in a way. I was trying to work out why that was, and I think it's because it is so totally different. Whereas GNOME and Unity I've just messed around a little bit, but the basic underlying paradigm is still there of a window with buttons on that you can move around and resize and what have you. And this is something just so fundamentally different that it was actually appealing in a way.
Well, don't get me wrong. If someone gave me one for free with a free subscription, I would love to play with it, but I'm not buying into it. It's the bottom line. And I think that that's probably how a lot of people will see this, that it's a curiosity, and if someone they know has got one, they'll play with it for a bit, but I just cannot see this taking off, but you never know.
Yeah, I think it's going to either fail badly or make quite a big impact, but I've a nasty feeling it's going to go sort of the same way as BIOS did, for example, and potentially just a few years down the line, we will see echoes of it in other products. I mean, it isn't open source either. It was just a curiosity that caught my eye. They do say they're looking into possibilities to open source part of all of the work they've been doing. But we've heard that before from other companies.
Yeah, some of the interface they had, I think, was around activities. So you'd sort of have a whole load of similar, I guess they still have programs and windows within one group of activities. That might be personal and then a trip. It sounded a bit like the sort of KDE idea of having activity-specific desktops and things. And just to clarify the sales point or the monetary point, they're €350 on Kickstarter at the moment. They'll be out at $450 in the shops, and the point that Joe made there was that it's a subscription based model, and so all applications, all backup, all online storage, everything is free to everyone as long as you pay your monthly subscription. That's the only way to actually have this service. So you won't have to sort of pay for applications, and the way they do it is they divide the money they get per month by each install of each application. So if you've made a really popular application, you'll get more money, but not through people buying that app specifically, through people just installing it. So it's, again, a different way of doing it, but you're absolutely right. I'm not sure I want a by-month payment model for my PC, thank you.
Well, yeah, at the moment you can buy a machine, be it a phone or a tablet or a laptop or a desktop, and it's a one-off payment, and then potentially everything else can be free. Free as in beer, especially if you use Linux on it. So the idea of an ongoing cost to use my computer is just ludicrous, I'm afraid.
No, I'm not convinced on that score, to be honest, because the economy is not going sort of great guns at the moment, and things are going to get more and more precarious for people throughout the world, I think, over the next few years. And we've seen a return to this rental position with people, phones, for instance. A lot of people do still have contracts with phones. It was always the model that started out there. But we're starting to see it for consumer goods as well. And maybe it's because I live in a different part of the country, but I mean, when I was a nipper, there was a shop called Radio Rentals where you could go along and rent a VCR or a TV or a washing machine. And it's what if you didn't have vast amounts of money? A lot of people did. And that died out, I don't know, through the 80s and 90s as people became more affluent. But that sort of economy is starting to burgeon again, and people are renting white goods again.
Maybe, but that doesn't change the fact that you've got to lay out a load of money for it in the first place, as well as this ongoing cost. I mean, if it was free or a marginal fee up front, and then you're paying them 20, 30 quid a month to use it, that would make sense to me. But the fact that it's going to be 300 or 400 quid outlay, and then you've got to have this subscription, that's where it's going to fall down.
Yeah, I can see them trying to recoup initial design and manufacturing costs. And if it takes off, then potentially a slightly higher monthly premium and no upfront cost would be the way to go.
Yeah, I could see that potentially working, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be interested, but some people would definitely.
Because that would bring it in line with the phone contract way of doing things, whereby I admit for a phone you're just slowly paying for the hardware, but if you just see it as a monthly payment, you end up with a new phone every 2 years. Whereas with this, you don't end up with a new version of it every 2 years. You're stuck with it until you pay another X £100 for the newer model. So yeah, if it feels just like sort of you rent the hardware and pay for your subscription on top for a monthly fee, that'd be probably a more appealing way of doing it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting bit of hardware and software, and it's not often we have that combination. Finishing off then with small devices, we've spoken about the BBC Microbit a couple of times on this show, and I haven't been horribly flattering about it. And largely that was because the press coverage at the time wasn't particularly explicit about what it could do, and it didn't look as if it could do a vast amount, to be honest. But I came across a blog post recently where it was explained that the NDAs that the various developers have been under have been lifted, and it goes into a fair bit of detail about how they ported MicroPython over to this platform. And there's a really good video, I think, on that blog post that shows some of the facilities on the Microbit, and I think it's well worth checking out.
But I could have just watched a video rather than read that whole blog post.
You didn't?
No.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
This is the fall down I have with using Pocket. But yeah, it is an interesting discussion about the fact that it almost didn't happen, and the way that they were really in bed with using sort of Microsoft installs and other bits of software that weren't as happy with Python. And so he does go into a lot of detail. So if that's your sort of bag, as I know Paddy loves, then do have a look at it. And we're yet to see if the BBC Micro is going to make any kind of impact, whether it be big or small. So we'll see what happens. And I guess the news is going to come out of our country only because it's only to our school kids.
Well, for now, they did say that they would open up the specification for it and make it available for general purchase, but it sort of got delayed, and now it's looking like it's going to be next year. So, yeah, I think it's one to keep an eye on. Now, we've gone on and on about OggCamp and how we're going there, and that's going to be next week. So do come along to that Halloween weekend in Liverpool. But for those of you who don't like leaving London, like me, generally, we're going to be having a meetup in the pub on November the 12th, which is a Thursday evening at the Mulberry Bush, which is near Waterloo Station. And we'll put a link in the show notes to my blog post about that, because Scott from Mintcast is coming over to the UK again, and Jesse's going to come along, and we're hoping to get Matt Copperwaite from Dick's Open Roadshow, Popey and Wimpy from Ubuntu Podcast and Linux Unplugged. And just anyone is welcome. So if you know someone else who might be into it and you want to come and meet me and Jesse, unfortunately Paddy won't be there, then come along and have a few drinks with us. Should be good fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. We did it sort of about this time last year, wasn't it? And it was nice to meet a bunch of our listeners and actually meet Scott, as you said. So yeah, come along and say hi. And in other super exciting news, we have our OzCon winner. Congratulations to Andy Mitchell. So we rifled amongst all of our applications and picked him out the hat. And so that is a free ticket to OzCon. So hopefully, Andy, you can give us some feedback on how it went and what it was like.
Yeah, and take some photos if you can while you're there.
Yeah, and take some photos of our logo, because a lot of effort went from our listeners to get that out there.
Yeah, if you do spot our logo, then yeah, do take pics of it. Right then, that's it for the news. Let's move on to Over a Pint.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of this show, I saw a blog post earlier in the week that was from Martin Gresslin, and he was trying to explain why Plasma 5 is so bad. Well, he wasn't. He was trying to explain why it's not so bad, but any problems you've got are down to everybody else. And I thought it would be worth picking the post apart a little bit and also seeing if it applies on a wider scale than KDE.
So he was saying that they thought from within KDE and the Plasma team, they had produced a very solid release, a very stable release, and they confidently sent it out into the world, only to find that actual real user experience was a lot of complaints about bugs and faults and failures. And he's tried to sort of, as you say, tease apart why there are these errors when they thought it was solid, and it seems to be not so solid in real applications. So he breaks down the numbers, and over the last year, there's been 1,300 crash reports, which is about 3.5 a day, which I don't think is too bad, but it could always be smaller. And he goes through and sort of says a bunch of these are unconfirmed, and a whole load of them, about half of them, are sort of repeats of other bugs and things, but still is discussing where these bugs are coming from. And the first reason or excuse or group in the firing line is the graphics drivers. And he's saying that a lot of the bugs and a lot of the faults are coming from the graphics stack and the drivers, which has nothing to do with the Plasma 5 desktop, and they can't influence it because it's coming from Intel or AMD upstream. And so it's not their fault. Or at least that's the impression I get of what he's saying.
That's exactly what he's saying, and he's saying he can't even do the testing, because your immediate reaction would be to say you need to do more QA on this and actually test it, and he's suggesting you can't do that simply because of the variety of combinations of hardware out there.
But I mean, isn't that one of the major problems with Linux and, I mean, to some extent Windows, that you have got so much different hardware? I mean, that's what makes it brilliant, is that generally speaking, you can chuck a Linux distro on any laptop or desktop and it's going to run almost perfectly. But having to support that huge variety of hardware means that it's never going to support any of it perfectly, or you're going to have a lot of edge cases where things don't work 100% at least.
How much of it do you think is trying to support all the newest features rather than just having a baseline that might not give you the optimum performance but is just solid and works?
New features like what? 3D acceleration and stuff?
Yeah.
It probably is that. And yeah, if you're trying to run a composited desktop that's got all sorts of swishy stuff that relies on 3D acceleration, then yeah, it's going to break. Whereas if you go for something open box based like LXDE, then you probably are going to have fewer problems. Yeah, maybe you're right.
He points out in this post that, as an example, the most often reported crash against KWin is a crash in Intel driver. And he's saying that they found out what that problem is, they found where the issue lies, and they've disabled one of the features, and all Intel graphics drivers will have that feature disabled, and they'll never enable it again because it causes so many crashes. And whether that feature is, a cutting edge or not, he doesn't say, but you have to think that if it is something that maybe gives you a little bit more performance or allows you to do something clever with 3D windows and things, you're never going to be able to do that just for the sake of stability. So they are actually cutting back on some things for the sake of stability and not implementing all the features of the graphics drivers.
Well, another problem that he talks about is that even if they fix things, it takes a long time, if ever, for those fixes to actually make it into distros. I mean, especially stable release ones like Ubuntu, for example, you are waiting potentially months for these fixes to make it into the distros. Whereas, it might only take them a couple of days to fix it.
It was an interesting point he made that if you're on the Ubuntu LTS, then you're on a stable distribution, and that is a good thing to be done, and you should expect everything to be solid. If, however, you're using any other version of Ubuntu, the interim 6-monthly releases, then you have to accept that that is a testing distribution, and new software will be coming out, and in theory should be patched, but to actually get the really, really new software, you have to update your PPAs and things and update the repositories that you're downloading from. And so he's saying that people who don't add these repositories are sort of in a sort of halfway house where they're not getting the absolute latest releases from upstream, and they're waiting for Ubuntu to release, the updates to this interim sort of release, the point release. And so you're neither on a solid foundation nor at the cutting edge. I think that's where he's having this frustration where they're releasing fixes, but they're not actually getting to the people who are using them, and the people are then complaining, and it's making them and the Plasma team look bad. So if you're on a rolling release, you'd be getting these every day, and you wouldn't have a problem, is the sort of argument he's making.
It'd just be everything else breaking around your head.
Yeah, that was sort of a takeaway I got from the end of this, was that while they might fix something, let's say, in the graphics stack, they will also require an update to the Intel drivers. They might require an update to X or something like this. And if you're not keeping up to speed with absolutely everything, let's say your distribution only releases an update to the Plasma libraries, so the Qt libraries and things, if they are requiring updates to other things to make fixes so that they come together and fix everything as one, if they're not updating all the different parts of the system, then you're not actually going to get those fixes in place. And it's this problem of distributions either need to keep everything absolutely up to date or everything further back, like the LTSs do, but actually updating bits and bobs when they rely on each other doesn't give you that cohesive sort of harmonious movement towards the modern and, in theory, fixed versions of things.
Yeah, and just to pick up on the Qt issue there, it does actually talk about the difficulties of not having control over that toolkit, and that they're having to deal with changes up the food chain from the Qt guys that they have very little control over as well. But yeah, I think the broader point and kind of why this appealed to me as a topic to talk about was exactly what you just stated, Jesse, and that really is how we do release management, how we get a stable system. A lot of people within our community don't actually care about having, I was going to say a stable system, but that sounds really bad and people take it as a slur. It's not. People want the most up-to-date thing. So you've got all the folks running Arch and they're happy with it. They're also happy spending an awful lot of time looking after it rather than actually getting work done. I guess kind of where I was coming from was one of the appeals of Windows within the business environment, and we spoke about Windows earlier in the news, is the stability, and particularly the stability of the APIs. Windows 95, we mentioned, coming out the same year as BSD, OpenBSD was first released. A program that was written for Windows 95 will still run today on Windows 10. Now, I can't imagine a program 20 years old that isn't statically compiled running on a Linux box today.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned the problems with upstream Qt and the issues they have there, and you have the same thing with GTK. I mean, I know that has caused a lot of problems, and you're right. Yeah, you can't imagine stuff from 20 years ago. It would be ridiculous. And we do spend a lot of time bashing Windows because it's just an easy target. But I think you are right on that one, that is a huge appeal. I mean, there are enterprise installations that will be probably looking to go from 7 to 10. And if you're looking to update, say, Red Hat like that, would it be as easy? I don't know. I've never done it.
Yeah, I really don't know how much a factor it really is, but it's always struck me that API and ABI compatibility is a real strong point on the Windows platform and a reason for its prevalence throughout the business world. And it is something that we don't do particularly well in our environment. And if you look at where Linux is successful, and that is in people's pockets, but that's because Android is quite a different beast from your typical Linux desktop distro. And it's in the server space where fine things get updated, but they're tending to only do 1 or 2 tasks at a time, and it's got a very limited set of software in each particular box. It's the desktop space where we have difficulty making inroads, and it's the desktop space that sees the most churn out of any of those platforms.
Yeah, but no one is running ancient installs of applications and programs on modern desktops. I mean, look at the way Microsoft are now forcing everyone to upgrade to Windows 10, and whether or not that be because, let's say, anything older than Windows 7 doesn't run on anything later than Windows 7, as they move up to Windows 10, they could change all the APIs, and as long as everyone is running the latest, every program they wanted would continue to run. I can't see many instances of people saying, oh, this great program that I had in Windows 98 still runs on Windows 7 or Windows 8. Isn't that fantastic?
Yeah, and maybe on Linux it doesn't matter quite so much. I mean, there's still plenty of XP systems out there running particular applications, and often it's because the people who made the application have gone out of business or the support is just no longer available. But because it's proprietary, you have to stay on the same platform, the only platform it actually works on. And I guess the argument would be that in the free and open source world, we don't have that issue. We could always pay someone to actually modify the code because the source would be available.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, going back to this idea of the servers have remained relatively the same. I mean, you get new kernel versions and new versions of things, but there's never any huge paradigm shift apart from, I suppose, to containerization and Docker and stuff, but that's a different story. But with the desktop, I mean, look at Ubuntu. I mean, I know it's like kind of almost beating a dead horse here, but they had the stability of GNOME 2, and that was potentially appealing to the enterprise market. And now they've got Unity. I mean, it's been a long time since they introduced it, but if you're looking at Linux from that point of view of trying to roll it out to an enterprise of, you know, potentially thousands of people within your company, you might think twice about it, because you think, well, if they're going to do that and go from one LTS to another being completely different, then that would put me off.
Yeah, very much so. And it's not just the changes, I think. I think it's the frequency. I mean, Ubuntu's got a 5-year release cycle, which sounds like a long time, and maybe for a desktop computer it is a long time. But if you're working in an enterprise and you've got a variety of specialist bits of software that aren't off the shelf, you're going to spend probably a couple of years testing your environment to make sure it works. Then you've got to deploy it. And if you're on a 5-year cycle, then you're going to basically be starting again as soon as you've finished, just to keep up with that release cycle. That's an awful lot of investment in your IT teams and infrastructure just to keep standing still.
Yeah, but what's the release difference between XP 7 and 10? Because from my work point of view, we went from XP to 7, and literally there have just been some people upgraded on some old PCs from XP. It appalls me when I see it, but it happens. And a friend of mine or a colleague of mine was upgraded to 7 the day that Windows 10 came out, and that's 2 releases of Windows later. And so you're saying 5 years is not long enough, but people are upgrading, and Windows is not being released, you know, every 20 years. It's more frequent than that. It seems like about 5 years.
Yeah, it is, but the support period is far longer than that. There might be a new version of Windows out, but the old version of Windows carries on getting supported.
And so really, it's only things like Red Hat that have got support that can match Windows then.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying, yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons that we struggle on the desktop.
From an enterprise sort of point of view, from a big business point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, because your average user isn't expecting support for that long. And if you're used to the way that Google works, you don't get any support. It just is thrown out the door and there's no way of contacting them at all.
Yeah, but you say the average user isn't expecting support. I mean, the average user doesn't even know what support really means in terms of security updates and stuff, but they would buy a laptop and expect, or at least hope, it to work for, I don't know, ideally more than 5 years, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but let's say you bought a Vista laptop, and then 5 years later you went back out and you suddenly saw Windows 8. The number of people that bought a Windows 8 laptop, my flatmate included, and is pulling his hair out because it's a paradigm shift. So I don't think it's fair to defend Microsoft that strongly as to how consistent they are when they do change things.
Well, that's true, but they do seem to have learnt from that. And now if you were to go from 7 to 10, it's not hugely different, is it?
Yeah, agreed. Windows 8 is definitely the one kind of outlier in the graph of consistency, which I unfairly picked on, I agreed.
Yeah, whereas if you look at the Linux desktop, I mean, the main one is GNOME. I suppose KDE, as we talked about earlier, has stayed the same, so fair play to them. But, GNOME and what happened to Ubuntu with Unity, and the fact that they have not realized that was a mistake. I mean, at least Microsoft, they might not have admitted it publicly, but by releasing Windows 10 looking the way it does, they have essentially admitted it, haven't they? Look, Windows 8 was a mistake, and now we've got something that works properly again. Whereas there's no way that GNOME or Unity are ever going to work properly again and, admit that it was a mistake. But then again, you do have the alternatives because it's open source, and, Mate was allowed to carry on. So, maybe people will just see that. Hopefully they'll become more popular.
Yeah, but I think we're kind of missing the point here a little bit, because desktop changes are one thing. It's really applications that people use and are important to them. They're actually used from a productivity point of view. And on Windows, you install an application, and unless you go away and explicitly find an update for it, it'll basically sit there. I mean, there are a few exceptions that install their own updaters and what have you, but on the whole, that's how it works. You go and download it, install it, and that's it, end of story. It'll carry on running for 10 years without you touching it. And in the Linux world, repos are a wonderful thing, but we're forever getting new software shoved down our throats whether we want it or not. And do you not think that potentially is disorientating for users as well and frustrating?
Yeah, I think repos are a double-edged sword, aren't they? Because I laugh at the fact that you have to go and manually update every single application in Windows by going to the website and downloading a new version and uninstalling and reinstalling, and it's a faff. And the idea of just going, Pacman SYU and apt-get update and upgrade and things like this, and it does your whole system, the absolute lot, is just a godsend when it comes to using Linux. But unless you're very, very picky and go through and say, oh, not this one, not that one, and does this dependency get updated and do they all get updated and things like this, you can either have stuff break because various dependencies have been updated and the application isn't ready for that, or some sort of interface isn't working because one has been updated and the other one hasn't, whether that's because the distribution you're using, the maintainers haven't, coordinated that release or what have you. And so you can have stuff, as you're saying, break on you, or not worse, but differently change. And you load up your application that you're used to last week, and you're saying, well, why is this looking different? Why is this, forgotten my settings or what have you? Because it's been updated and maybe hasn't been done seamlessly. So I see what you mean about that, but I think that this comes back to the idea that people who use Linux, dare I say, and have done so out of finding it themselves, out of their own choice, are going to be the more tech-savvy people, whereas the people who have Linux on their machines because they've been guided towards it by people like us installing it on there will be a little bit more surprised when their software changes and things.
Yeah, but I think just dragging it back to the blog post that we started with, isn't this kind of exactly what Martin's saying, where he's suggesting that any issues people have with Plasma Desktop are really outside of his control? It's things being done to him, to his team, by outside entities. And that's exactly the position your average end user on a Linux desktop faces day in, day out, as things are updated outside of their control.
I suppose what you're getting at is that the experience that people will have, generally speaking, will mean that they have to, if not fix things, at least know a bit about how things are working, because things are going to change. Whereas if you just go and buy a laptop from Currys or Best Buy or whatever, things are generally not going to change unless you want them to. And I mean, I don't want to end this on a negative note, but I'm afraid that it's pretty much going to be. And we talked about how laptops are pretty much going away. I mean, we might see some ARM laptops coming along, but I just think that we're never going to get to a point where Linux on the desktop is mainstream. We're never going to see that fabled year. It's always going to be a niche market or a niche group of people using it, because no one's interested in desktop computing anyway, generally, apart from the enterprise. And although Red Hat's done good work there, and although Canonical are trying to do good work and they're making some inroads, the fact is that Microsoft has got the enterprise market completely sewn up. And so you're pretty much never going to see the year of Linux on the desktop, I'm afraid. It's always going to be people like us, and you might get the odd person like my mum who, a geeky person, has set up their machine, but I just can never see realistically a point where you can go into a shop and buy a selection of Linux machines. There might be, like eBay, I've got 3, I think, Ubuntu AMD machines that are a bit ropey, HP, I think. But, you're never going to go into Currys and see half and half Windows and Ubuntu or any sort of Linux. It's just a pipe dream.
So in his blog post, he touches on rolling releases, having all these updates, and some of the more stable releases, not getting them, and how the differences in those can mean you're either everything is working or everything crashes all the time, depending on quite how you install your system. And I do just wonder whether or not a distribution like Solus OS, where he's doing the full background and the DE and pulling it all together as one thing, would mean that you have fewer of these problems. However, it does take a while for a small team to get these things out, and that's another item that he touches on, which I feel we're not going to have time to get into, but the number of people they have means that certain features can't continue, or certain tests and updates can't happen because they don't have the resources to do it, whereas Microsoft is, for all intents and purposes, a bottomless pit of resources and expertise to get all these things done. So there's a different problem that I think Linux faces, where while things might well feasibly be possible, it's going to take so many people so much time, and a lot of these distributions, are there too many, are there not, just don't have the resources to do all that.
Well, I think that brings us back to Canonical, and surely this is one of the reasons, possibly the overriding reason, why they've gone down the route of rewriting various bits of the whole stack themselves, so they've got the control and they're not reliant on other people, and if things break, it's them that's broken it.
Yeah, I agree with not having to be reliant on other sources and things like that. Every time I'm doing something, to my house or something, and I rely on external workmen and things, you're at their beck and call. Whereas if you're doing it yourself, you're in your time frame, you're the one that makes the problems, or you're the one that has the fixes. And so generally you're able to get things done. And from Canonical's point of view, they're trying to get these things done. They're trying to move to this convergent desktop. They've got phones, all these sorts of things. So I can see why they want to have it all in-house and all close to their chest. And that may well be the way in which they have to go in order to compete on the big stage. I mean, I pointed out Solus OS having their own desktop environment and their underlying operating system. Apple has got the hardware wrapped up as well. So they have full control on everything, and look how well they're doing.
Well, with that then, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, or find us on Twitter or the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, faithful listeners.
I'll still be ill next week as well. See you later.